Have you seen? We were just talking about For All Mankind,
I
TV
love that
show. Fucking awesome, isn't it?
I love it.
I've only just started it. Are you right? Are you right? Are you right up to date?
Yeah, she says a it's so good.
No, spoilers! No, spoilers! No. Jesus, God. I don't want to know. I don't want to know who that was. I don't know who that was. Oh. La la la. Welcome to Cloud Realities, a conversation show exploring the practical and exciting alternate realities unleashed through cloud-driven transformation. I'm Dave Chapman.
And I'm Rob Kernahan.
And you will hear, unfortunately, we haven't got Shauk with us this week. She's on vacation still, so big shout out to you, Shauk. We're missing you, and we'll see you soon. But with us this week, we have a very special guest for our 50th episode. We have Jean Kim with us. So Jean is the author of the DevOps Handbook, the Phoenix Project, the Unicorn Project, and most recently, Wiring the Winning Organization, which is his new work, looking at liberating our collective greatness through slowification, simplification, and amplification. And we are delighted that Jean's joining us, and we'll join Jean in a second. But Rob, before that, 50 episodes, what do you make of that?
I think, Dave, just before we continue this conversation, and I don't want to be the pedant on the show, but we have...
Again, you're going to be the pedant again.
Wouldn't know about that. I would like to call it. We've actually done 71, but yeah, let's not get facts. Oh, I completely messed that up. Yeah. Sorry, I can't say...
It's easy for you to say, Rob.
Man, you guys aren't very good at this.
No.
You'd think after 71 episodes we might be able to do it, but... Let's not. What's the phrase about fact? We shouldn't let facts get in the way of
a good story. Yeah.
Although it has been an interesting 50 episodes, lots of lives in there actually making it 71, but we're not going to talk about that.
No, it's my arcane numbering system that means that this is the formal in-studio.
Official 50 good episodes. Is that what the way
thank it yeah. God we've got a professional guest for it, Rob.
I know, because it's amateur hour over here, isn't it? Although we've had lots of fun, and one stolen monkey, so that's a
chaos monkey. I think you're fine. Thank God you're here, Jean.
I'm so glad. I'm so delighted to be here. David, some number of years since we last talked. And so thanks for having me on. And Rob, so good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Really good to have you, Jean. I'm dying to get into this conversation. So look, let's start with winding back in some of your earlier and very illustrious works, Jean. So let's start with maybe the DevOps Handbook and just walk us through a little bit like the handbook and then Phoenix and Unicorn projects. Give us a through line for you about how that arc feels, maybe reflecting on it a little bit.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, so just some background, the DevOps Handbook came out in 2016, and that was really the attempt to sort of codify what I had learned to date studying high-performing technology organizations. That was started for me back in 1999 when I was the CTO and technical co-founder of a company called Tripwire.
Feels like a different world, doesn't it? Now?
Yeah, no, exactly.
Tripwire? What happened to Tripwire? Where did that go?
So I was there for 13 years, and I left right after we had completed our S1 filing to go public. And so I left. We never actually made it to the public markets. And so I left to work on the Phoenix project full time, which actually came out in 2013. And, that was, so I'm so grateful for the Tripwire experience, and I can't tell you how many of those lessons learned. That when the DevOps Handbook could have come in really handy. Back in 2004 and 2005, the Phoenix project was that business fable about a technology leader's attempt to ship products quickly while trying to maintain reasonable uptime and availability and achieve security and compliance objectives and failed miserably, and what they did about it. And so that was based on one of my favorite books called The Goal by Dr. Eliyahu Goldratt, which was a novel about a manufacturing plant manager who had to fix his cost and due date issues in 90 days. Otherwise, they would shut the plant down. Right, and so this book sold 5 million copies. It's taught in most MBA curriculums. And so the Phoenix Project is really literally modeled after The Goal.
Right.
And so the DevOps Handbook was meant to be the non fiction prescriptive guide, that would be the companion to the book that says, all right, how did they achieve all those incredible things that were described in the Phoenix Project?
And when you look back on the influence of, I mean, particularly the Phoenix Project thing, but the DevOps Handbook as well, and you see now that many organizations in the world are sort of, if they're not doing it, they're aspiring to do it. And it's a major part of cloud native culture and cloud native conversation. What do you reflect on as what you think are the biggest influences that it had? And also what are the influences that it had that maybe surprised you?
Yeah, what I am really so proud of in the DevOps Handbook, which I co-authored with Jez Humble. So he's, famous for many things, but he was also the co-author of the Continuous Delivery book, which I think changed generations of developers in terms of, how do you think about a different way to merge and integrate and test and deploy into production.
Right.
And it was also Patrick Dubois, who famously coined the term DevOps back in 2009. John Willis, kind of famous for his contributions in infrastructure as code. He was one of the early people at Chef, and one of the early DevOps days people with Patrick Dubois. And also Dr. Nicole Forsgren, who I worked with on the Accelerate book and the State of DevOps Research. She came in and contributed to the second edition. I think what was remarkable about the DevOps Handbook in 2016 was that I think it was one of the first books to really codify practices that spanned development, right? Like Continuous Delivery did, QA, like so much of the the testing and QA books, and kind of this next generation infrastructure practices and platform engineering practices, and put it all into one book.
Right.
One of the things I'm just really proud of in that book is that there were 50 case studies that weren't just the tech giants, but half came from large, complex organizations, that don't look like Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Microsoft. But instead, they represented some of the largest brands across almost every industry vertical. So, I think that was what made the book unique and hopefully influential in people's journeys.
The thing that really struck me when I read the Phoenix Project and when it influenced me, and it was probably going back, it's probably 10 years ago.
Yeah,
now,
that's right.
Actually, when I was certainly, and that's when I picked it.
It had its anniversary, didn't it? Because there was a big fanfare about it.
Yeah, in fact, it came out. The book came out 11 years ago.
Oh, well, congratulations!
2013.
Right. Incredible, and still selling strong, I'd imagine. It was the humanistic part of it that really struck me. So you can talk about these concepts in manualistic terms, but the idea that there was a sort of here's how the humans all interact in these situations, and you got that through the novelistic take on it. I thought was really powerful. That was really powerful.
Yeah, I think what is still surprising to me is just how it seemed to identify this universality that happened in any organization. I mean, I think I can't tell you how many emails I've gotten and how many times people have said, "Holy cow, it's like you've been hiding in our conference rooms. You just described the meeting I came out of. I know these people." And I think for me, the lesson, and in fact, I say it's surprising, but it's also not surprising because Dr. Goldratt, who wrote The Goal, he said the same thing. He said, how many times do people say it's like you've been hiding in our manufacturing plant? We just had our boss helicopter in, right? And describe about an order that must ship by the end of the day, right? And and it's because I think he identified these forces that were at work within every organization, right? And so in manufacturing, it was between sales and manufacturing and the production scheduling system. And in DevOps, it was that chronic conflict between dev wanting to ship features quickly into production, right? Ops wanting to not ship features because it would always jeopardize uptime and availability and security, right? And so when you have those sort of forces in opposition, you do end up with these common themes and these common patterns of like what goes wrong, right? And so there are human issues for sure.
Although that point about you hiding in the boardroom, I now have a mental image of you crouching behind a plant taking notes as you record the horror that's unfolding in the traditional ways of working.
Just a funny, that's an interesting observation, Rob, because when people ask where did the Phoenix Project come from, I mean, it was literally a file I kept on my Palm Pilot called the quote file. Right. And every time I would hear something. Yeah, exactly.
So it is literally, that's what you were doing. And that's the beauty of it, is it the anecdotal evidence builds over time to say there's enough of this here now to show that it's it's endemic or systemic, whichever way you want to describe it. But it's that this is the reality.
Without doubt. Right. And you hear certain people complaining, or you hear it characterized in certain ways, right? And you just realize, there's something really interesting happening here. And so I started that back in probably 1999, 1997, right? And so by the time to write the Phoenix Project, I had over a decade of quotes of things that I thought were hilarious or insightful that just had to go in the book.
I thought the bit in the Phoenix Project that really resonated with me was the section of it. And I'm probably going to misquote this horribly, Gene. So do feel free to correct me here. But there was a great bit where you showed the lag time between all of the different ticketing systems that go on in an organization. And I'm like, yes, that's the quantifiable element that I'm going to try and get to grips with.
No, absolutely. In fact, that was something I wanted to explore in the Unicorn Project as well. Is this? What does a worst case architecture look like? How can you design a system?
Plenty of them about.
Yeah.
Right. I'm probably responsible for a few.
Yeah. So the Phoenix Project was told really from the ops perspective, right? And the Phoenix Project was essentially the same story told from the dev perspective. And I thought was what made the thought experiment so interesting was you take Maxine, the organization's best developer, right? She's one of these, some people would sort of think, oh, that's one of the quote mythical 10x developers. You take her, right, who's creating greatness all around her, and then she gets marooned in the Phoenix Project, which is a wasteland of technical debt, neglect, of silos that can't communicate, and you've basically negated all of her superpowers, right? And she can't do anything. She can't build, can't test, can't deploy, can't can't get logs, can't get anything, right? And just as a lesson was really that this is not the fault of the individual contributor. This is a fault of leadership, right? Is that somehow leadership has created a wiring in the organization that has made it impossible for even the best engineer to do their work easily and well.
It's that thing about creating. How do you create autonomy and empowerment in an organization, but still do it in a way that means that people don't go crazy and do the weird stuff? And there is a bit of trust, and it's that you've got to let trust propagate through the system, and then make sure you're learning as you go. And I think so many organizations still struggle with that. They try and lock everything down because they think that's the way to do it, and it's counterintuitive sometimes for them to think, actually, no. If you give people the freedom, A, they're happier, B, they're more motivated, and C, they do a better job.
Yeah. In fact, can I just pick up that thread? Because I think that was really the core of the mission going into working with Dr. Stephen Spear from the MIT Sloan School of Business on the book Wiring the Winning Organization that came out Thanksgiving 2023. And the notion, right, that there's these platitudes that leaders have to enable autonomy and empowerment, right? And that's true, but it's really how does one do that, right? And
the practical nature of it,
exactly. And there was another mystery that had been on my mind for going on a decade, in fact, over a decade, which was both Steve and I shared the suspicion. In fact, let me introduce Steve first. So he is famous for his contributions to studying the Toyota production system. So he is the author of the famous Harvard Business Review article called that was published in 1999 called Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System.
Right. Which is that leading to lean and all that?
No, absolutely. It was he was part of that second generation of researchers looking at what made Toyota so different. And so that was actually based on his doctoral dissertation at the Harvard Business School. And in part of that work, he worked on the plant floor of a tier 1 Toyota supplier for 6 months. And so he extended that work beyond just the high repetition work of manufacturing to engine design at Pratt & Whitney, to helping build a safety culture at Alcoa. And so, after taking his course in 2014, I felt like there was many people have pointed out that the beliefs of DevOps were so much influenced by the work of lean into the production system, but there are actually very different types of work. And so, what is in common between DevOps and Agile and lean and Toyota production system, and for that matter, safety culture, resilience engineering, psychological safety? And so, after 3 years of work, our conclusion was that there are all incomplete expressions of a far greater whole. And I think the real lesson in the book is that the job of leaders is to enable their people in their organization to do their work easily and well. And
do the right thing well. Make the hard thing
well.
hard to do and the right thing easy to do, basically.
Absolutely. And so when you go back to the Unicorn Project and Maxine's plight, right, is how is it that you can take this same engineer, put them in one setting, they are able to do incredible things. You put them in another setting and they can do nothing, right?
Yeah.
And so whose fault is that? It's not Maxine's fault. It's the leader's fault.
And we'll come on, I think, to wiring the organization in a second, but I do want to dwell on the Unicorn project. And yes, what I think you were about to say, now I apologize for interrupting you there, but like, what do you think the outcomes of the Unicorn project were? And are you happy that those have sunk in enough into the industry?
Yeah. I am so... This is actually one of the favorite things I've written. If the Phoenix Project was meant to sort of point out something, that we've all felt, the Unicorn Project was meant to be sort of like the worst case scenario. Let's see if we can conjure up a scenario.
Right. That is so bad.
Yeah, it's so bad. Right?
Yeah.
And what's kind of tragic and also hilarious is that many people say, I recognize the situation. Right?
Yeah. It's like, it's my day job. That's my day job. Yeah.
But it was meant to be a thought experiment of like, and I'm so grateful to that because I don't think I could have co-authored Wiring the Winning Organization without that full exploration of the space to say what are all the ways that we can deprive people of their ability to have independence of action, right? To do their work independently without having to deal with scores or hundreds of other people. For them, to be able to work in conditions where you can do experimentation safely, to do your work safely without causing, even small problems causing giant problems, right? That you have no feedback on your work. You can't see what you're doing, right? And it turns out like those are all the dimensions, right? That, is required to, do your work easily and well, right? And if you can't do your work easily and well, there's no way the organization, can achieve the most important things that the organization needs to do.
What I love about that is you've literally theorized the worst possible thing that could happen. And then there's loads of realities that it completely aligns with, the people holding their hands up. You just go, how is that true? Maybe it could get worse. Who knows? But there's like, I think a lot of people empathized with it and meant it's not just me. It's not just my situation. I'm in a club of others as well. And I think that is almost like a catharsis through this is how it is, that people understand that it's not just them stuck in their reality thinking, how did this happen? There is some commonality with others. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Just one of those heartbreaking things is that because the Maxine's plight, because they have to capitalize their development hours, she has to time card and log everything, right? And so not only does she have to face the indignity and frustration of not being able to get anything done, she has to record it in the time log, right? And a good friend Mick said, "Oh my gosh, he's had to deal with that, right?"
Yeah.
Mick Kirsten wrote the project to product book, CTO at PlanView, formerly TaskTop. Anyway, just the fact that I thought that was a bit kind of pushing the absurdity a little bit too far, and I've heard from so many people like,
it's true, it's happened, it's a reality.
Yeah, it's terrifying, isn't it? The amount of organizations you come across that, I mean, literally have sort of textbook versions of this problem. They have technical debt that's almost completely unavoidable at this point, and they have to create massive acts of transformation to get themselves out of that situation into something different. And that's not an exception, is it? That is like the norm. And like one of my observations on this is, I think that IT generally are, and particularly in kind of, let's call them more traditional organizations versus more modern tech organizations, IT had become such the report to the CFO, very financially driven, manages a cost center, and it hasn't had the opportunity to, constantly self-modernize and constantly evolve as a function because it's being managed down, 5-10% each year in cost. And then they're just going to sweat the environment the whole time. And it builds up malfunctioning organizations.
Yeah, that resonates deeply with me. And I think that represents a reality that I think is unfortunately all too common.
I sort of almost blame the millennium bug and then the sort of the initial .com boom hysteria, not the work itself, but the hysteria around it. Because it seemed like so many expectations in boardrooms were misset by what IT could and couldn't do in the late 90s and some of the issues it might have that then either didn't manifest or they didn't manifest in a big enough way. And, and boards are almost like, like yet another IT thing. Let's just shift that over. They're costing too much. Let's push them into the corner, into a box. And actually, we're living with the regret of some of that.
Yeah, and if I can just extend that a bit further, and I think the kind of the logical continuation of that is that technology becomes the order takers of the business, right? We just quote do what the business says, right? And it becomes a transactional. In fact, that's an interesting word you use, right? It becomes transactional versus developmental, right? Where it's I say you do, right? And which is sort of the opposite of what we want, which is that the job of technology is not to obey the orders of the business. Instead, it's really to help achieve the most important goals of the goals, dreams, and aspirations of the organizations that they serve, right? And to liberate everyone's ability to solve those problems. And hopefully that transformation is described well in both the Phoenix Project and the Unicorn Project, as well as in the DevOps Handbook and Wiring the Winning Organization.
Well, let's use that as a perfect bridge into wiring the winning organization. And first of all, frame it for us. So tell us about what it was like going into it. You touched on it a little earlier, but let's return to it. What was your thinking going in, and where did you end up with its sort of core concept?
Yeah, right. I had mentioned before to you that it was working on this book with Steve was the most intellectually challenging thing I've ever worked on, without a doubt. In fact, there were probably 2 points or 3 points where, at least two, where I was wondering if I was not smart enough to finish this book, whether that it was maybe time to walk away.
I feel like that reading books, Jay.
Yeah.
Famous 5, Dave. How many did you get through?
Gets to be a struggle.
But it was also the most rewarding thing I ever worked on, just because I think anyone can take something simple and make it look complex. It's really much harder to take something complex and legitimately make it simple enough where you've actually identified something fundamental.
It's the famous misquoted Churchill thing, isn't it? Which is he opens a 2-page letter apologizing for sending a 2-page letter because he didn't have time to write a 1-page letter.
Yeah, and so what was really great was in this exploration is that I think we came up with a very satisfying explanation of what is in common between things like Agile, DevOps, and Toyota Production System Lean, and so much more. And the conclusion is that there's really only 3 mechanisms of performance. Whenever you see an organization go from good to great or not so good to great, there can only be 3 mechanisms at work. And it's because that essentially there's 2 zones. We call it the danger zone and winning zone. Is that the danger zone is really meant to describe the worst possible conditions in which to solve problems.
Right.
And so let's conjure kind of what that is. That you're solving something under enormous time pressure. That if you make a mistake, it's catastrophic. And if it's catastrophic, you can't undo. And that means that you can't experiment and learn. So learning is is iterative, it's experimental, right? And so if you're doing something,
it can be messy.
Oh, absolutely, right. And so if you can imagine, solving a really tough problem in production during an outage in a highly coupled situation where changing one small thing can take everything down, right? That's kind of the worst case condition to solve problems, right? And so, let's imagine the opposite. Ideally, what would you want? You want to be able to be doing experiments and learning, not in production, but in planning and practice. You are working on a small piece of a problem that's decoupled from everything else. That means you can make small changes, and in the worst case, it results in a small problem, right? It doesn't sort of ripple out and cascade into a large problem. You have fast feedback. You can see what you're doing. You can see what the results are, which means you can iterate and learn, right? And then you can sort of codify those. You can build up the routines, intuitions, playbooks, so that when the time comes, you can actually do them even in the most intense, time critical situations. And so, that's what leads into the three mechanisms. So the first one is about slowification. Right. Solve problems not in production, but in planning and practice. And so, like, whenever you see someone doing highly consequential work and they look, they can do it flawlessly, they had to have invested in planning and practice.
Yeah, they drilled it. Yeah.
So the first slowification is all about sort of moving where that problem solving is happening, right? From production to planning and practice. You want to push it kind of earlier in time. The second one is simplification, which actually changes the nature of the problem being solved. So the worst case is you have everything tightly coupled to each other, right? Yeah. So that you can't change one small piece without impacting the other pieces. So there's really three ways to break the problem up, which is, either you incrementalize it, right? So small batches, so that should resonate with anyone doing agile type stuff. The second way to do it is modularization. So you take the big problem and partition them into small problems so that they can be worked on independently. And what's interesting is the third one, which is you can linearize it. Modularization, it should sort of evoke into your mind like the API re-architecture of Amazon in the early 2000s. They went from a situation where even small changes require 3,000 engineers to have to coordinate and communicate. And
so another blast radius on the change, isn't it? Where you go,
yeah. Oh, exactly right. Exactly right. So we can talk a little bit more about that later. But so they moved into two pizza teams, created more of a service-oriented architecture, which allowed that independence of action, that blast radius containment,
decoupling, really
exactly.
Yeah.
And so one of the key aha moments, the biggest aha moments, is that the Toyota production system, assembly lines, that's like the same thing. What modularization does for parallel processes, linearization does for sequential processes. So an example of that in our world would be CI/CD pipelines. That work that was once all in a big Gantt chart crossing three different ticketing systems, you want to tie together into like an assembly line process, which not only you can automate, but actually creates independence of action, just like modularization. So now the build engineer can do things independently of the QA engineer and of the security engineer, right? And you get this single piece flow. So that's what a marvelous sort of insight that was. And then, so that's simplification and then amplification. You want to create a system that even weak signals of failure can be amplified so they can be decisively acted upon to ideally prevent, but better detect and correct for the problem. And so, you want a system that is rich in feedback, that people can see what they're doing. And let's just imagine the opposite. Imagine a system where even weak signals of failure are suppressed, unheard, or even extinguished, right? Because
I can't imagine that happening. No. Generally, things are very transparent, is what I find.
So those are the three mechanisms: slowify, simplify, and amplify. And some of the practices that we associate with, whether it's lean or DevOps, you can easily slot into those three categories.
Well, let's maybe take each one in turn and have a look at it through the lens of a case study, if that makes some sense. So let's start out with slowify then. So that was solving problems up to the front of the chain when you're in a position, the way I heard it anyways, when you're in a position where you can take your time, dismantle things, and you're not going to have a production impact, versus trying to problem solve within the heat of the moment. Is that, have I got the gist of that correct?
Yes, and what's interesting is one might observe that slowify is not actually a real word, so we had to make it up. And the reason why is that
we work in tech, we make up words all the time. You're happy? We'll add it to the dictionary next year. Just say it enough, you'll be fine.
Oh, doing this show, I'm so used to made up words, Gene. They just pass me by now.
Well, we didn't do that lightly, and our observation was that there's no single word in English that describes this very recognizable concept, or because we have a lot of adages for this notion that you have to slow down to speed up, or you have to stop sawing to sharpen the saw. This notion that you're making a short-term investment for a longer-term gain. And we felt that that maybe the lack of that word is the reason why that it's very difficult. There's some people who say if you can't say it, you can't think it.
Well, it's funny that you should observe that, because literally, as you were saying that, I was thinking not only does it lack a word, but actually it lacks quite a lot of implementation in real life. Lots of people do throw those phrases around, but actually the reality of the situation is, I'm not sure people really do that. Or when they do that, it's such an uncomfortable conversation to get into.
Right. No, exactly. So our hope is by creating this word that it will allow people to say, "Hey, look, we are being forced to solve a problem under the worst possible case conditions, right? Either we are solving a problem in production where we haven't developed the routines and habits and tooling to be able to even do this work safely, right? Maybe we need to slowify, right? Or better yet, we are potentially entering a situation where we're going to have no idea what we need to be doing, right, to handle these scenarios. Or another way that I think comes up so much in software development is, just this need, just even this ability to say, hey, we need to take a time out here, stop working on features and build some tests for this, or refactor, re-architect so that it is testable, right? Because, currently we have no feedback, that we're writing code that's going to blow up in production. And so that too is a slowification.
And I think the important thing is having the presence of mind or the capability to be able to step back and understand there's a structural disadvantage to your approach. And those organizations that spot that structural disadvantage and go, guys, this just isn't working. We need to change your way. Let's embrace the new. Let's think differently. I think that's quite rare still, where they can look at a thing and go, this isn't working. We need to reboot the way we think about it. And I think there's almost a two-tier structure. There's those companies which will adapt their thinking and they're thriving.
Yep.
And there are those that don't adapt their thinking and they're dying. And it's almost like things like this and the ability to spot it in leadership that's going to create the companies that become the ones that we know the names for the future, and those that are assigned to the history books or get bought out or just get crushed because they never changed the way of working and thought about those core real structural issues.
Yeah, 100%. And so one of the goals of the book was to have this book aimed not just at the technology leader, but also their boss, to create a common lexicon, a common set of concepts and terms, to be able to have a conversation and make decisions together to help achieve, the most important goals of the organization. And so because of that, there's 25 case studies in the book, of which only 20% are technology related. And I think one of the things I'm very proud of in the book is that we're taking these concepts and boiling them down to things that everyone should be able to recognize. And so, in terms of slowification, something I learned that I thought was just to help me recognize it was, if you look at sports teams, right? They go into, in fact, we went to a basketball game a couple of weeks ago, and, they have so many playbooks in the coach's back pocket. There are little time cards, little cards that are quick reference guides of, what decisions are we going to make under these conditions in the third quarter? I mean, these things are not made on the fly, right? The toughest decisions are actually made, there's like a decision tree that's made beforehand so that you're not making extemporaneous off the cuff decisions, right? During production. And so, you have timeouts, that you can trigger slowification. So all these things are things that you need in sports, but you also need in manufacturing, you need in software development, and you see these patterns everywhere, right? And I think one of the aspirations I have in the book is that this will give technology leaders a way to communicate. Here's a signal that we need to slowify, and this is not us trying to gold plate something. No, this is required for everyone in the technology organization or team of teams to do their work well.
There was a point you brought up in the middle of that thought, which was around common lexicon that I'd love to come back to in a second. So let's just hold that in the air, because I think there's something so materially important about common lexicon between business and technology. The fact it's even described differently is an issue in my mind. So maybe let's come back to that in a second. But I just want to finish the deep dive into the model first.
Yeah, can I give you maybe a case study?
By all means. Yeah,
yes, two of them come to mind. I'll go deeper into the second one. We had mentioned. We were talking about the Apollo moon landing before we started recording. And so studying the landing of the first Apollo 11, where it has just never been done before, right? What do you do when you have no experience going to a situation where no one's ever landed on the moon before, right? You have no
panic, yeah.
Right. So
how many times a day do you get that feeling, Rob? I reckon 2 or 3.
So if you can't,
speaking personally,
if you can't undo, right, where must you invest your effort? It turns out there was a tremendous amount of investment in planning and preparation, in simulations, in building high fidelity simulation hardware so that astronauts could get, by the time they're doing their first lunar landing, they've actually done it scores of times in production like scenarios. And it was just so great to see like the dynamics that went into that of just how much was invested to make sure that by the time Neil Armstrong is piloting the lunar lander 6,000 feet above the moon, it's not the first time that he's done something like that.
The other thing that occurred to me, because we'd had that conversation when you were describing the elements of the framework, was their approach to modularization and simplification as well. Because when you see coverage of things like Apollo 13, or we were chatting about For All Mankind, the TV show, which have based a lot of their, there's a lot of real life stuff taken into the drama there. And when they have an issue in that, they break teams off very quickly. You guys go and solve that element of the problem. We'll take this element of the problem. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. In fact, because you have to decompose problems so that they can work on separate pieces independently, right? So that's absolutely modularization. For simplification, I think the common, most recognizable one for technology leadership would be the largest in 2011. That was a big AWS, the the US East one availability zone going down. So this is like AWS Cloud's largest so data centers. Outage. Yeah, and so when that went down, most of the largest customers went down because that's where they put their largest customers. But the one curious exception was Netflix, and what made it so curious is that they had talked so publicly about running entirely in the AWS cloud. So how could they be running if they're running entirely in the cloud? And so the answer, of course, was revealed in that famous blog post on, I think it was April 11th, 2011, when they unveiled Chaos Monkey.
That was brilliant. Everybody, I was just so revolutionary in thinking about actually sending something in to break your systems to test it. I loved it.
Why did they do that? They said, for us to migrate to the cloud, we have to have no single point of failure risks. And they had concluded that the largest single point of failure risk was AWS, right? I think they even said they will never be there when we need them most. And so what they did was they built this thing called Chaos Monkey that would randomly kill production servers, VMs in the cloud, during office hours.
Absolutely a tremendous bit of counterintuitive thinking.
Absolutely. And so if you are a developer who's responsible for not just building a service, but running the service, and there's something killing your services in the middle of the day, you're going to get very good at making sure that in some sort of automated way that you can fail over to something else. And so, that massive investment in planning and practice, is what resulted in this magnificent performance in production, where they were, running wonderfully well when everyone else was simply down.
Well, let's move on from that to simplification itself then. So, building on what we've just been talking about, simplification you talked about in your summary, which was about linearization, it was about modularization of problems and breaking it down. What was a case study in that space that resonated with you?
Yeah, for sure. Let's do modularization. Yeah, so we actually studied the Amazon e-commerce transformation in the early 2000s. And it was actually amazing. I had studied that for over 10 years, and rereading kind of the papers and the interviews of Amazon CTO Werner Vogels, then CTO, still current CTO, it turns out I had missed something really important. And I actually interviewed Jesse Robbins, who was a famous master disaster at Amazon in the early 2000s. So my new understanding of this was that Amazon in the late 90s, it was a pretty simple software stack. It ran on Netscape e-commerce server. It was written in C++. The Apidos was written as a C++ plugin. It ran on two databases, Oracle for e-commerce, and I think it was Berkeley DB for the book database. And it was pretty simple for them to push code into production. They were doing it hundreds of times a year. But as they added more product categories, they went from 2 categories to by 2003, there were 35 categories, toys and music and apparel, so clothing, right? So they went from, a handful of SKUs, shopkeeping units, to, 50, which each one required a database schema change. And so the result was that as the number of teams grew, the ability for teams to independently be able to develop, test, and deploy into production went down, right? In fact, in the interview of Werner Vogels, he described this ridiculous situation in the early 2000s where the digital team, so that's Kindle, Amazon Music, Amazon Video, when a customer would order one of those products, they would still have to provide a shipping address, a physical shipping address. And the reason was that when those teams went to the 35 different ordering teams and said, hey, could you please change the ordering flow so that you don't need a shipping address for these digital products? They said, we didn't budget for it. We can't do it. And so they became stuck. And so the net effect was that they went from doing hundreds of deployments a year to being able to do only tens of deployments a year. Most deployments did not finish because something would go wrong.
And what they had to basically then fundamentally re-architect their system to create a more loosely coupled approach.
Absolutely, right. So that is what led to the famous 2003 edict from Jeff Bezos that said, we're going to reorganize the company into these 2 pizza teams. No teams can be no larger that can be fed by 2 pizzas, which can all work independently and autonomously be thrown at Amazon's largest problems, which then required the re-architecting of the code base and the services so that these hard modular boundaries could be created so that teams could make changes to their parts of the system without having the need to communicate and coordinate, let alone schedule, prioritize, escalate, up 8 levels, down 8 levels to even do small things.
And it's quite a courageous thing to do, to look at something that you've built and put blood, sweat and tears into and then say, nah, we're going to completely recreate it from scratch to make it do the job that we now know we have to do.
Yeah.
Because our understanding of what our problem is has evolved because we've learned on the way. And it takes a lot of leadership courage to be able to stand back and go, nah, we're going to start again because it's going to be better when we do it.
It's a great point because it's not just companies like Amazon that have this problem. So it's visible in so many problems across the world. And that's whether it's built on COTS products, commercially off-the-shelf products, or whether it's built in kind of stuff that they've built from the ground up. These problems that are the technology getting in the way of innovating and moving fast because of decisions that might have made complete sense 10 or 15 years ago now need to be resolved properly. And my observation is that so many organizations just try to round the corners off on these problems rather than going, right, we've got to take a step back. Oh, and actually we've got to do some fundamental re-architecting or transformation of the environment to allow us to work in the way that we want to work.
Absolutely. So I'd love to just bring up 2 things. One is what was the reward of Amazon doing that? What made it, was the juice worth the squeeze, right, as they say? And then, how common this problem is across so many organizations. So the amazing outcomes of that decision from Amazon was that they went from doing hundreds of deployments a day in the late 90s to tens of deployments in the early 2000s. By 2011, I think many of you will remember this, John Jenkins said in 2011 that they're doing 15,000 deployments a day. And we were all shocked, right? And one deploy every 11 seconds. And then in 2015, they came out and said, we are doing 136,000 deployments a day. Right. And so
it's nuts, isn't it? But it shows it works when you think about it.
Absolutely.
It's incredible.
So this is the notion of creating independence of action so that teams can work independently of each other. And so let me give a counter example I just heard last year, which was so heartbreaking and horrible and yet awesome. Someone said, I'm part of a mobile phone company, and the top initiative of the year is to put in front of every one of our 20 million customers a checkbox that allows them to opt into a $5 a month service for email, for music, for movies. It will take $40 million. It will take a year because it has to transit across 40 different teams across all 4 channels of the customer. So it's retail, that's physical stores, e-commerce, support, and so forth. Mm-hmm. And most people, it will require daily war room meetings, CEO -1 level support, and most people will estimate that give it a 20% chance of success. Right. Why? Because the last 2 times that tried it did not work.
Right.
My word.
So
that doesn't feel good. Yeah, I wouldn't be the one who got that hospital pass.
yeah.
It's unthinkable to think that. Did anybody ever stand back and go, what you're actually trying to achieve from a business concept is relatively simple? And it's like, has anybody gone back and gone, that's good value for money, isn't it, lads? Come on, let's have a think about that for a second. It's that they're ploughing on with it and thinking, hang on a minute, maybe, just maybe, we should make some changes elsewhere to make this sort of thing easy.
So what's interesting is that so by the way, does this problem resonate with you? I mean, maybe have you seen a friend, client struggle with this?
It's this so horribly entangled operational structure, and change has to transit so many commercial vehicles and team vehicles that it just kills it on the way. And at the end of it all is a project manager who sat in the corner with a tinfoil hat on, wondering why the world hates them so much and why they have to tackle this thing. And then when they get it in, there's this huge sigh of relief when it eventually works. But the amount of effort expended to do what is pretty simple, and nobody actually stands back and go, yeah, that wasn't great value for money, but they keep doing it and history keeps repeating itself.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly.
We see it. It
so
resonates.
This is the same problem that Amazon found itself in the early 2000s. And so what is magnificent about this example is that technically this is not a terribly challenging problem, right? I mean, it's more than just a couple lines of HTML code, I'll granted. But this is so a year's worth of effort spanning 40 different teams, hundreds of people, right? It's not the technical work that is dominated by it. This is all coordination cost.
That's right.
And so the language that we put in the book to describe this is that there's really three layers of which work is done. Layer one is, the work in front of us. So that could be the code we're working on. It could be the binary running in production, right? It could be the patient in the hospital. This layer two is, the tools that we use, the IDE, the, Kubernetes, or, the MRI machine. And layer three is the social circuitry. It is the way which nodes in the system interact with each other, right? How do teams interact with each other so that they can do their work? And so in this mobile telco example, it is a failure of design in the layer three organizational wiring.
Right.
And so what's incredible, right, is that if you look at Amazon before and after, right, if you look at Netflix before and after, right, the only thing that changed was layer three, right, the management system. And so it is not the project, sure, the project manager is responsible for trying to get this checkbox projects done. But ultimately, it is the responsibility of the technology and business leaders for the wiring that they created that is making work so impossible for people in the organization to do their work.
I'll give you a personal example of that. When I ran a large-scale cloud transformation program 10 years ago. Is when I came across a Phoenix project the first time. We were having a problem. It was a basic refactoring migration to the cloud, but it was on a very large scale. And we were finding that we could not get to the cadence of migration that we needed to get to fast enough. And we were having all the same, kind of sticky board conversations and log jam conversations that you're reflecting in a number of your books. Is exactly like that. And actually what we got to is one of the fundamental problems was to use your similar version of your words, the wiring of just the IT organization and the tick speed that the organization had been designed to run at was actually running too slow. And it was the tick speed of the organization, the sort of the meta organization around it that was slowing down the migration.
Yeah.
And an example of that was, a decision had been made that any things that get added to the Active Directory, any objects to the Active Directory have to be almost personally signed off by a team of 3 people that is so highly skilled. It's a 12-month lead time to get another person into that team. And it was like this, right? And it was like layer after layer of the onion that were all getting in the way of actually trying to thread a needle somewhere else. Is that the sort of thing you're digging
absolutely. And so we chose the word social circuitry, organizational wiring, right, as layer 3.
I like them very much. Those terms are great.
And the goal, it's metaphorical, not figurative. We're saying that the organization is like a electronic circuit, like code, like a hydraulic circuit, mechanical circuit. And what a circuit does is it gets things that are stored in one area and moves it to where it's needed. And so when, to your point, Dave, there are circuits we can build that where when you need something, you never get what you need when you need it in the right format, and it's always too late. Right, and so the circuit is doing exactly what it was designed for, or you can rewire it so that everyone has what they need when they need it in the right format, in the right place, and they're not having to talk to everybody. They can talk to one person, or better yet, they don't have to talk to anyone at all, right? And that too is a function of how leaders design the organizational circuitry. So, we can talk about like how poorly social circuitry can be created, that can be fixed with modularization. I think so many of us have also lived through, poorly designed linear sequential processes, like code deployments where, in the Phoenix project, it required 45 different teams, that, you add up all the work to get a VM, test environment to, say, a developer, right? And it takes 9 weeks, right? And the reason is that, there's 3 different ticketing systems with 3 different priorities, right? And that, to get what you need through all of the different work from the different functional specialties requires massive escalation, because the coordination mechanism of of what was there is just not sufficient. And so, why is CI/CD so much better? Is because those different activities were linearized. We found exactly what we need from all of those people. We tie those work centers together, right? And ideally we automate them so that the interfaces between the systems are known, and suddenly you can get independence of action, just like modularization did, even though these are sequential activities. And so, again, we can wire our deployment processes so that we get really horrible outcomes and it takes a long time, or you can wire them differently, like in an assembly line, and get, fantastic outcomes that, take, not weeks, months, or quarters, but instead take, minutes, worst case hours, and deliver, better outcomes, not just for operations, but for developers as well.
Well, let's use that as a jumping on point to the third part of the model, and amplification, and where you've seen either good or bad instances of what that means.
Yeah. I think so again, with amplification, the goal is to create a system so that even weak signals of failure are amplified so that they can be decisively acted upon to better detect, correct, and ideally prevent. And so I think for me, one of my favorite examples of this in the technology space would be, the notion of, what is required, to run, great infrastructure and operations. And, we call that blameless postmortems, or, post-incident reviews, where, when something bad happens, engineers are trained or to lead, these blameless postmortems, that the goal is to create this chronology, not to blame someone, but to figure out what actually happened. What were the mental models? What did they see? What actually was happening? That led to people making decisions that they did. That led to outcomes that weren't so great.
Right.
I think for me, one of the stories that made it into the DevOps Handbook that I loved was from Randy Schaub, who ran Google App Engine. So he was the engineering director there, and he said that whenever they had a customer impacting incident, they would lead these blameless post-incident reviews, and the outcome was that the number of incidents went down, right? Because they were learning from these, they were putting in good countermeasures to the point where they didn't have enough customer impacting incidents to have postmortems on. And so what do they do about it?
That's a good problem to have, isn't it? They get out of the habit of doing postmortems very well because they didn't have any reason to do postmortems.
No, they made a different decision. They said, instead of doing it for just customer impacting incidents, let's do them also for team impacting incidents. So when we find ourselves in a situation where there were 7 safeguards that were designed to prevent a customer impacting incident, and 6 of them failed, all right, what happened there, and how do we make sure that doesn't happen again?
Yeah.
So this is such a great example of amplification.
And did you look into the open and closed system theories around that? You take the open system, which is the airline system we talked about before in the podcast, where when a mistake's made, it's understood. There's rules and regulations about pilots declare it. It's safe for them to do so, safe environment. They talk about it. They understand it. Processes, procedures, redevelopment. And guess what? The airline industry is very, very safe. Compare that to the medical system, which is closed, and when mistakes are made, they're not discussed and not talked about, and consequently the rate of preventable deaths in medicine is much higher than it is in the airline industry. And if you actually had there was this stat that said if the airline industry behaved like the medical industry, 2 jumbo jets a week would crash.
Yeah.
And nobody would want to fly. And it's like completely different systems showing completely different outcomes, and you know which one you'd rather be with him.
Yeah. In fact, I'm so glad you brought that up. Of the 25 case studies in Wiring the Winning Organization, I think a third of them are medical related. And they show up mostly in the slowification chapter. And this is heartbreaking. One of the case studies is, we call it the Miss Morris versus Miss Morrison, where there were 2 patients in a healthcare system and the wrong patient was operated on. Despite 15 events that said something is wrong here, including the patient saying, "You've got the wrong patient." Right?
We're still going to operate on you.
Still operating.
So that Monty Pie.
It was horrible, right? And we're laughing. There's nothing funny about it, but it does evoke this horrible reaction.
It does.
Where instead of pausing in production, right, they said, "Let's keep going, or we're going to ignore the signal," right? And we described this other case study where they were able to decrease the rate of infection rates for C labs for this particular surgical operation, by 3 orders of magnitude by doing the opposite. Whenever something was not going as planned, they would call it, just like they would in a well-run airline or normal operations and crisis operations, and slowifying to figure out, what is wrong either in the playbook or in the situation, and how to make sure that we don't stay in the fast-moving production mode, right? The fast-thinking environment, and revert to a slower thinking, more methodical, analytical mode, to make sure that we don't let habits and routines take us to where we don't want to go.
Right, particularly if you've got a patient on the stretcher shouting, "It's not meant to be me! It's not meant to be me!"
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, it's farcical situation that can happen. It's just unbelievable, isn't it? But it has happened. You just go, well.
It is a great, I know it's a real life scenario, but it's also an excellent metaphor for how many times that actually probably happens in thousands of different scenarios. It's glaringly obvious that something like you're going to operate on the wrong patient, but people press on anyway.
Well, so let's consider production deployment where involves 3,000 steps, right? And someone in one point might say, "Oh my gosh, that's odd," right? But let's keep going, right? And 2 weeks later, you have a massive failure of an ETL pipeline, and all the revenue-generating servers stop sending transaction events, into the big Hadoop cluster. I mean, that's never happened, right?
But that's the consequence of if you're in the middle of a very complex process and you're the one who puts their hand up and says, "Is this the right thing to do?" The consequences of your actions are it might stop all the pre-work spin. It's the right thing to do, but then it's that structural disadvantage again that says the system's stacked against the odds. So people just go with the flow because the concept of them stopping that flow is so great that they fear the consequences of saying.
In other words, they made a decision to they succumbed to the operating tempo, and instead of pausing, the operating tempo sort of prevented them, or people felt like they were prevented from doing the right thing. The amplification, this is based on information theory. Cloud Shannon described how signals have to be generated, transmitted, most importantly, received, acted upon, right? And then, ideally, you confirm, that the corrective action was actually satisfied the need. And I love that because it actually says, these are the things that must happen. So when you think about, Dr. Westrum's organizational typology model and psychological safety, really, this is represents failures that could be at the generation mode. People can't say what they really think because they, if you do, you get fired or punished. Or it could be a problem with transmission or the receiving of it, right? They're not heard, or it could be failure upon acted upon. So I love this clinical treatment of the social circuitry in this way because it gives us even better tools to diagnose, is this a signal generation problem or is this a signal transmission or reception problem? As Dr. Cloud Shannon said, right, the most important part, communication success is measured by the receiver, not the transmitter.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's another dynamic is that, you want not only all these critical actions in the value stream, but they have to be done quickly. And I think you had mentioned airlines, Rob. The application chapter opens up with something that happened in winter of 2022, which was a Southwest Airlines cancellation failure. So this is when the big winter storm hit in the United States, and it shut down everybody. There were thousands of airline cancellations, but something really peculiar happened. Is that within 3 days, most airlines resumed normal operations. Or in Southwest Airlines, the number of cancellations kept on climbing, right? And so what happened, as documented in the business press, was that it was this crew scheduling system. So at the end of each day, whenever a crew was not where they were supposed to be and the plane, they would have to call this phone number to the crew scheduling service and tell them where they were so they could redo the schedules. But they were often on hold for hours, or sometimes in one case like 22 hours. And so when it came time to resume operations the next morning, right, the planes were not where they were supposed to be, and so they had to cancel more flights. And so essentially they had to reboot operations, right? So they would fly these empty planes to where they're supposed to go, right?
Literally have that same problem in the UK with train strikes. So they'll have, the train unions are quite active at the moment, and you'll get days where, your 7 or 8 services an hour will be down to 1 or 2 services an hour because a lot of them are out on strike. But then actually that lags over into the following day of disruption because all the trains are in the wrong place.
Exactly. So what does it have to do with our work? This is now an example of where the control overlay, layer 3, cannot keep up with the production environment.
Yeah.
And so in the worst case, you have to stop operations, right, to get planes to where they need to go, trains to where they need to go, or get the parts in the assembly plant to where they need to go. And so the mark of a great management system is that it is faster than what it is controlling. And so to your point, when you have those Active Directory authorization processes that take 12 months, right, you have a control process that is probably profoundly slower than what it needs to go, right? Somehow you need to reorganize the social circuitry so the decision-making can happen much, much more quickly to match the tempo of what is needed.
Now, let's maybe bring our conversation to a bit of a conclusion today by returning to the subject of lexicon and common language between business and technology. And I think within that, there is something in all of this to me about the role of leadership itself, and maybe modernizing leadership thinking to be able to deal with, increasingly tech-driven organization. So maybe let's start with your thinking on lexicon and where you got to that.
Yeah, it's a great point. In fact, the reason why I laughed is that when you said we need to modernize, and I was thinking, boy, wouldn't it be a shame if leaders thought we have to modernize technology, the layer 1 and layer 2 parts of the system. Like, no. What needs modernizing is leadership thinking, the layer 3 activities, right? And you're so right. And so absolutely agree with you. Our goal of the book is to help create a vehicle for technology leaders to have better conversations with their leadership and their business counterparts, and not talk about microservices and CI/CD pipelines and open telemetry and Kubernetes. Right? Instead, here is how organizations work. Here's why they work the way they do, right? And here's what we can do about it. And it's my genuine hope that by creating a common lexicon, by describing how systems work in so many different industries, in the different phases of value creation, technology, non-technology, manufacturing, design, and so forth, that we can help people have an aha moment of like, oh, here's why it takes a year for us to deliver this checkbox initiative, that seems so easy, right? And say this is not a layer 1 or layer 2 problem, it's a layer 3 problem, and this is our responsibility.
And then drives that courageous decision that says, actually, we need to stop and take a step back and look fundamentally at how this organization is wired.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned a Winston Churchill quote. One of my favorite Winston Churchill quotes is, we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. So too, we shape the wiring of our organization, and forever after, right, it shapes us.
Right.
And something that we didn't put in the book because it seemed a little bit mean-spirited, which I'm all for, but Steve thought it was very important that we didn't make anyone look stupid. But if I could just put this here as like what I what's really in my head.
Yeah.
I love this. Dr. Westrom introduced me to the notion of the socio-technical maestro, right? A great leader has usually 5 characteristics: high energy, high standards, great in the large, also great in the small, and they love walking the floor. And I just like, oh, yes. Now that is absolutely resonate with me in terms of like what I've seen. But he also introduced me to this other quote. He called it Rabinow's Law number 23. If you have a dope at the top, you will have or soon will have dopes all the way down.
Right.
This has a lot of explanatory power for me as well, because it simultaneously explains, the best systems I've ever seen designed, that are enabling people to do extraordinary things and do it easily and well. Also explains my most horrible experiences where personally, not only could I not do my work easy and well, but I also hated my job, right? Because even small things required like super heroic amounts of effort, right? And, even when you did get it done, the outcomes were nothing to be proud of.
Gene, thank you so much for the insight there. I mean, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and that was it was wonderful getting updated and just seeing where you're getting your thinking to at the moment, and deeply resonant, I think. Well, look, we end every episode of this podcast by asking our guest what they're excited about doing next. And that could be, I'm excited about a great restaurant I've got booked at the weekend, or it could be something in your professional life. So, Gene, what are you excited about doing next?
Oh my gosh. I got to tell you, now that the book is done, I've been having so much fun. Actually, without any guilt, working on generative AI projects. I
thought you were going to say sitting on the sofa, staring at the wall, doing nothing.
There's been some of that, but I haven't been having this much fun programming in decades. It's just there are so many things that are now within reach. Forget about things like not just like these kind of co-pilots that are available, but
right.
just to see how good these LLMs are at categorization, summarization. And so I am just amazed at how many problems can be solved with so little effort these days. and so I've been spending a ton of time just analyzing emails, summarizing the experience reports from the DevOps Enterprise Summit. And I gotta say, I think what's so interesting is that there's no doubt to me that something amazing is happening in technology, but the job for the technology leader just got a little bit harder. If I can just make a little segue here, one of the other sort of mind-blowing things I learned working on the book was Steve telling me that apparently healthcare systems, which are so notoriously complex and to run these days, was actually somewhat easy to run in the 1950s because there were only 2 functional specialties. You had doctors and nurses. Whereas you compare that 70 years later, now there are scores of functional specialties just within the clinician space. You have, there was no technology back in the 1950s, right? Now you have technology everywhere, each one of them with a layer 2 technology team supporting it. So even radiology is not just radiology. It's x-rays, it's MRIs, it's CAT scans, right? So they now call it imagery. So think about the responsibility of the layer 3 circuitry, which if it looks similar to the 1950s, it is so insufficient to do what it needs to do now, which is why you have so many horrendous experiences in healthcare these days.
Interesting.
So technology, the layer 3 social circuitry has to get increasingly sophisticated the more functional specialties you add. And so the job of the technology leader just got a little bit more complicated because now you have not just dev, QA, ops, information security, and quote the business. Now you have the ML ops, AI engineers, right? You have to move dev further to the left to these ML researchers and these people working with the LLMs, and you have to move those groups to the right so they can work. If you are delivering live results to customers, right? They can't be in an isolated silo. They need to be, coexisting and living with the production services in production. So,
I mean, fascinating that observation, because Rob and I have been kicking the ball around a little bit, and we're going to do more on this both on the show this year and sort of generally in our day job about what macro AI transformation begins to start to look like.
Yeah.
So at the moment, there's a lot of dotted use case And each of those are quite good in their own right, and some of them are actively very impressive in their own right. But it's like, what does the aggregate of that begin to look like, and how does that reform organizations?
Yeah, and I think there's one conclusion. I don't claim to have any ability to prognosticate the future, but one thing is so clear. I mean, I think it's indisputable. As you increase the number of functional specialties that have to be integrated, into a common purpose, the layer 3 organization wiring must change. And so, and as you increase the number of functional specialties, the job of the leader has just gotten a little bit more difficult, or maybe a lot more difficult. And so, I would say anyone who thinks that this is going to be an easy change, I think is going to be, mistaken. And which is the reason why we've actually renamed the DevOps Enterprise Summit. We've done 19 conferences since 2014. We've renamed it to be the Enterprise Technology Leadership Summit.
Brilliant!
Because
well, it becomes that becomes the challenge.
Yeah,
like if you get the thinking at the leadership level in the right place, and it's going after the right sort of goals, you get a lot of sort of knock-on effect down the structure that you were describing before. And the reverse is also true. That if you don't do that, it's not quite as you might as well give up and go home, but you ain't achieving any macro, differently dynamic outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's what DevOps is all about. That's what I think many of us had in our head in 2010. But it's funny that over the years, now people are saying, why would I want to go to a conference about CI/CD pipelines and automated deployments? So it's like, no, that's not what the conference is about. No. And so I'm super excited to the conferences because we've had over 600 organizations, 1,300 speakers present, and the last year we had a third of the talks be around generative AI. Just show us what the frontier looks like and tell us how you're integrating this into how you shape your organizations. And we need to learn, because I think generative AI is has the potential to impact how every parts of technology in our organizations run.
Well, thank you for that, and good luck with the repositioning of that, because actually it's a small naming change, but it's not a subtle movement in the conversation that needs to be had. And I wish you very well with it, Gene.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for having me on. And I so much look forward to the next one. It's been some years since you and I last talked, Dave. So again, congratulations on all your successes.
Thanks, man. Roll on the next one.
So for this special 50th episode, a huge thanks to our guest this week, Gene. Thank you so much for being on the show. Thanks to our sound and editing wizard, Ben and Louis, our rejuvenated producer, Marcel, and of course to all our listeners. We're on LinkedIn and X, Dave Chapman, Shauki Zal and Rob Kernahan. Feel free to follow, connect with us, and please get in touch if you have any comments or ideas for the show. And of course, if you haven't already done that, rate and subscribe to this podcast. See you in another reality next week.